Hello and welcome. In this lesson, we'll be creating a bookstore application, and we want to be able to use this application to create books and add them to a database and fetch books from a database, update and delete books, and also search for books. We're going to be using a MongoDB database, and this time we're not going to be using the MongoDB package, but we're going to be interacting with the database using Mongoose. So we're going to install and set up Mongoose. So before that, we're going to set up our application using Express. And let's start with that. Let's start by setting up our application, running npm init, and installing Express to our application. So I'm going to head over to my terminal and run npm init. Why? So that we can skip all of the questions. All right, so we have that set up. Next, I'm going to install Express. Npm install Express, and just give that some seconds to run. All right, and that is done. So we have our project set up and Express installed. So I'm going to head back to VS Code and create a new file, my index.js file. And here I'm going to require my Express module, require Express, and then I'm going to um, start the app with the Express function. Also, I'm going to set up a port. Let's use port 4000, and then I'm going to listen to that port, app.listen ports, and then a callback function, console.log app listening on ports, and that will pick whatever port is. And I'm going to save this and start up my server by running node index.js, and I should get that on my console. All right, so app is listening on port 4000. So great. Now we need to set up Mongoose. Um, we're going to set up Mongoose. We're going to create a schema, and then we're going to create routes for these actions right here. Now, in the previous lesson where we set up MongoDB, you would remember that we used something called a connection string to connect our Node.js application to our MongoDB database. The same concept applies here too. We will be using a MongoDB connection string to connect our application to the database, only that this time we're not using the MongoDB package, we're doing it using the Mongoose package. However, the Mongoose package, when we installed it, it usually installs MongoDB alongside. Okay, we've not installed that yet, sorry. All right, so let's install Mongoose first. I'm going to close this and install Mongoose. Npm install Mongoose, and give that some seconds to run. And that should be done in some seconds. Okay, so this is done. Now if I go back to VS Code now and I open my node modules folder, you would see that alongside with Mongoose, we have the MongoDB package installed here. So Mongoose would also install MongoDB, which comes to tell that Behind the scenes, what Mongoose actually does is to run MongoDB commands. It only does a lot of abstraction for us, which means that we do not interact with core MongoDB commands, but Mongoose gives us some commands we can use, and that makes us interact with the database in a more efficient way. All right. To start now, we're going to install Mongoose. Sorry, we're going to set up Mongoose. We've installed it already. So we're going to set up Mongoose right here. So to set up Mongoose, we're going to require it const mongoose equals require mongoose. Next, we need our connection string, similar to the one we used in the MongoDB lesson. So we are going to have something like this: const connection string equals something like this: MongoDB localhosts on port 27017, just like we had it then slash. So whatever we add here is going to represent the DB name, the name of the database which we're connecting to. So let's use a database called book app. So I'm going to save this, and then we're going to um, connect our application to the database. So to connect, we run mongoose.connect, and this will take three parameters. The first one is the connection string, or the URI, which we have here as connection string. So I'm going to type in connection string. The next parameter is an object of options, just like we have when we use MongoDB. So we have something like use new URL parser, and we set that to true. And then use unified topology, set that to true too. And then there's a third one, use find and modify, set that to false. Yes, and then the third parameter will be a callback function that takes in one parameter, which is the error. And what we want to happen is, if there's an error, console.log the error. This means that the database connection was not successful, and then we want to know why it was not successful. Otherwise, console.log database connection successful. I'm going to save this, do this on a new line. Yes. So I'm going to restart my server now. Node index.js, and we should have, yes, and we have this. All right. So our app is listening correctly, and our database is correctly connected. So now let's move on to the next thing, which would be to create our schema. Create schema. So the schema is the starting point for anything we want to do using Mongoose. What it does is to give a structure to our database, and sometimes to set some rules which we want to implement between the application and the database. The schema does not restrict the database in any way. What it only does is to act like a middleman between your application and your database. So let's create a schema for books. So to create a schema, we do something like this: const book schema equals new mongoose dot schema, and then we pass in an object, and what would be in this object would be the values we expect to be in our um, data and what data types we're expecting. For example, we have here that we want the book to have a title, an author, a category, purchase count, image URL, and description. So let's use all of this. So what we want to do here is that the title should be, of course, we know that the schema data types are string, number, array, objects, date, there's boolean, there's buffer, and then there's object ID too. So we'll be coming across some of these as we continue, right? Okay, so let's start with the title. So the title here, we want the title to be a string. So this is how you construct your schema. Uh, the name of the field in that document and what data type it should be. So string with a capital S. All right. Then the next one, we want the author to also be a string. Next one, we want the category to also be a string. Um, Purchase counts should be a number. Image URL should be a string. Um, description should be a string too. Let's move description up a little, although the position does not matter, but just to give some description. String, category string, purchase count number, image URL string. Let's add one more. Tags, and we want this to be an array. All right. So to complete this, I'm just going to say const book equals mongoose dot model book from the book schema. All right, so let me explain what we just did now. So what we just did is this book, this book here in this string represents a new collection in the book app database. And what we just did is that anytime we are creating a new document in this collection, book collection, we want the data to be structured in this kind of way. Now, does that mean each book has to have all these fields? No, it does not mean that. But what it means is that when the application is trying to create a book and it passes a title, we expect it to be a string, or Mongoose coerces that value to be a string. So the same thing for the author, description, category, purchase count, image URL, and the tags. So this book now represents a document. So each time we use this book variable here, we're relating with a potential or an existing document in the database inside this collection. So what this line does is to create this collection book from this schema, this book schema. All right, so let's um, see how this is expected to work. So with this now, I can do something like book dot find, same way you would do um, db dot collection books dot find when using MongoDB. But in this case, we'll be using this book to represent all of that. So that is just the difference between how Mongoose works and how the MongoDB module works. Also, behind the scenes, we wrote book here, but Mongoose will pluralize this word in the list of collections on the database. So on the database, we will see something like books. All right. So let's just experiment with that a little. Let's do book. Let's create a new book. Book.create. Um, let's give it a title. New book. New book. Author. Uh, Author Mike. Description. Very new book. Category. Let's say finance. Purchase counts. Let's say 40. Image URL. Let's just give it random url.com, and then tags can just say tag 1, another tag. So I'm going to save. Okay, before I save this, let's add a callback function to this, and that callback function will take error and doc. So this, okay, let me name this properly, book rather. So if there is an error, console.log the error, else console.log book. So I'm going to save this, and then we're going to restart the server. If I put my cursor over this book here, you would see that um, it represents the newly created documents from this action here. All right, so let's restart the server and let's see what it's printed to the console. Okay, so app listening database connected, and then we have this book created, and you can see how it's structured. Let's open Mongoose Shell to see our database. So I'm going to use the Mongo shell by typing in Mongo, my terminal, and that should start up the shell. Okay, so show DBs. Of course, this contains some other databases I have, but you can see the book app database which we are using. So I can go ahead to say use DBs and I can say show collections. Oh, sorry, I'm using the wrong database. Use book app. Sorry. And then show collections. There you can see the books collection, right? From this line of code here, mongoose.model book. And like I mentioned, Mongoose will pluralize the word written here and create a collection out of it. Also, if I run db.books.find, you can see the book which was just created right here. If I come to the Mongo shell here and I create a book without following this schema, there is nothing that would stop it. It would be created right right there and then, right? But like I mentioned, Mongoose only acts as an intermediary between the application and the database, but it does not determine what can be written to the database or not. So it just gives us some level of control over what can be written to the database and how it can be written. Okay, uh, so this is how we can create. We can also find. Let me comment this out. I can do a find book.find. I'm using the Mongoose query commands, and then I can add a callback function error books, and I can say if there's an error, console.log the error, else console.log the books. I can save this and restart my server here, and you can see books comes back as an array. And so this is just how would interact with our database using Mongoose. First of all, we create our database connection, then we create our schema, and then afterwards we can begin to use um, this modeled schema in our code. We can now use it in a post request to create a book. We can now use it in a get request to find books and so on. In the next lesson, would um, continue with this, but we'll be reorganizing our code in a more structured way. As you can see now, we have about 59 lines of code on our index.js file. So that means if I'm having, let's say, 20 routes in my application now, I'm going to have hundreds of lines of code in one single file. So we want to split up our code in different files and see how we can organize our code better. So there and then we'll be creating our routes and moving on with Mongoose. So I'll see you in the next lesson.